The Ukrainian army says it's repelled Russian forces from a strategically important suburb of the capital, Kyiv. The Defence Ministry says the outcome of the battle in the suburb of Makariv has prevented Russia from surrounding the capital from the northwest. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he's willing to discuss a commitment from Ukraine not to seek NATO membership in exchange for a ceasefire, withdrawal of Russian troops and Ukrainian security guarantees. But he says it's essential to discuss terms one-on-one with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And the Ukrainian people will have to agree the terms in a referendum. In the meantime, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine continues.
In the occupied Ukrainian city of Kherson, residents gather in defiance of the Russian invaders. The response, stun grenades and gunfire, causing the crowd to scatter. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky condemned the incident in a speech to the nation.
These slaves sent by Russia have never seen so many free people in the squares and streets. They have never seen thousands of people who are not afraid of them, of slaves with weapons in their hands. Slaves perceive freedom as savagery, as danger. They are scared.
Russia's military is not only attacking civilians in areas it occupies, it's also attacking civilian targets in areas it's not. Monday's bombing of a shopping mall in Kyiv and the relentless bombardment of the besieged city of Mariupol have caused outrage in Ukraine and abroad. But it has not weakened Ukrainian resolve. The president closed his speech with an appeal.
To save our people, fight. Fight and help. Drive these slaves out. Drive the occupiers out, so that Ukraine lives, so that all of us live with it, free and peaceful.
Speaking later to the press, Zelensky said that any peace deal with Russia had to be sanctioned by the people.
I have not met with the Russian negotiators, but explained to our negotiators at the talks that when one is talking about changes, and these changes are of historic importance, there is no other way around it. We will have to hold a referendum.
Having suffered through war, Ukrainians are to have a say on the peace that follows, when and if it can be achieved.
Our correspondent Fanny Fachai is in Lviv in the west of the country. President Zelensky said he's willing to give up NATO aspirations in return for peace. Could that spark progress towards some sort of deal?
Yeah, that's the big multi-million-dollar question, to say so, because there have been negotiations ongoing, actually starting on February 28th, so 4 days after this war started, after it began. There have been several negotiations about just how to, if not stop the war, but at least slow it down. That did not happen. Now, already last week, actually, both Russia and Ukraine signaled that at least it seems that there is some sort of progress to agree on a formula, to say so, about a possible neutrality of Ukraine. But you can hear in my wording also that so many eventualities, and unfortunately so far nothing came out of it. So now President Zelensky repeating the very same, to say, all right, we are ready to discuss that neutrality by saying we are not going to join the NATO if, and obviously that comes with the condition of that Russia needs to also guarantee the security of Ukraine by withdrawing from this country, which clearly is not something that we see is in the playbook of Russia right now. So yeah, this announcement was made again by President Zelensky yesterday, but the outcome of it is completely unclear, because for now at least we did not have any direct reaction just yet from Russia.
And what about direct talks? What's the likelihood of these two leaders, their countries entrenched in war, meeting face to face?
Russia made clear over and over again, because that demand also was made, or that request was also made by President Zelensky, that there must be really a direct meeting now with Russia's President Putin, whether this is a video call or any form of meeting, but the two men need to talk. Now, Russia made clear that they can only imagine that face-to-face talk to come into place if there is some sort of a deal agreed on during the negotiations that usually take place amongst these delegations from Russia and Ukraine, which are spearheaded by the presidential advisors of both countries. So the devil really lays in the detail here, and it's really like a catch-22, because Russia says, okay, there will be a face-to-face meeting, but only if a deal is agreed on, that then again can be put forward on that table between Putin and Zelensky. So at this point, it's really unclear. And as I say, there was no reaction just yet, but it's not expected that stance of Russia is going to change all of a sudden, and Putin is going to say, yes, I'm going to meet President Zelensky also, because observers say if he did that at this point into the war, that would almost look like a concession from the Russian side. So this is more likely, according to observers, to be taken to take place if more territorial gains are made by Russia here in Ukraine.
What about Russia's tactics in this war? You've told us time and again about the psychological aspect of this invasion, and every day we hear about civilian buildings coming under attack.
Exactly. 4 weeks into this war, a lot of operations that Russia calls a military operation of this full-scale invasion have stalled, actually. They couldn't really capture any major city during the 4 weeks, but of course, unfortunately, certain towns like Mariupol are reduced to rubble. And also yesterday, just yesterday, a shopping center, or rather Sunday evening, was destroyed in Kyiv, and residential neighborhoods also in many parts of Ukraine, including Kyiv, including Kherson, including other parts, which clearly tells you maybe that the entire strategy to take over Ukraine is stalling, because it didn't happen overnight, what a lot of people expected from Russia, because they were having so many troops across every part, to the north, to the south, and the eastern region of Ukraine. But it does mean, unfortunately, that this war is not going to become more brutal. In fact, the Ukrainian military made clear also yesterday that the citizens here need to brace for a more intense shelling of their neighborhoods. So clearly this is not something that you would want to hear, hoping that there is going to be any way out of this war, at least a stop to it, so people can be evacuated from especially intensely, heavily shelled parts of Ukraine like Mariupol.
Fani Fachar, thank you very much for the analysis, and stay safe. Kharkiv is also under bombardment. It's just 50 kilometres from the Russian border in the east. The relentless attacks have seen a large number of the city's 1.5 million residents flee. Those who've stayed behind face a daily struggle for survival.
Above ground, Kharkiv is a ghost town. Weeks of relentless shelling by Russia has laid waste to residential areas, hospitals and schools. Daily bombings bring with it new casualties. And it's forced those who have remained in Ukraine's second largest city to retreat underground. We have been here since the 24th of February. Near our house, the school was on fire. Tanks were on fire. That's why we decided not to go back there. It is cold here. The children are getting sick. They get eye infections. They suffer from the cold. They cough, as you can hear. Food in Kharkiv is running out. People queue for hours to get aid. Some of those choosing to remain are channeling their efforts into clearing debris and securing what's left of their city.
Honestly speaking, I don't see much sense in leaving the city. Joining the Territorial Defence Force, I don't have any military experience, but I can help the city with my labour. Why not? No, I'm not planning to leave. We'll stay here till the end.
Kharkiv has managed this long to defy the Russian forces attempting to crush it. It's hoping it can hold out long enough to survive this war.
Here's a look at some other developments in the war. US President Joe Biden is urging American companies to protect themselves against potential cyber attacks from Russia. He also repeated US warnings that Moscow is planning to use chemical weapons against Ukraine. Biden has called President Vladimir Putin a war criminal. A predominantly Ukrainian school in Chicago has welcomed 8 new students who fled the war. Teachers organised a vigil to remember those who've died and in the hope for an end to the invasion. The school says it's preparing to welcome another 50 Ukrainian refugees. And dozens of Ukrainian orphans on their way to the UK are stuck in Poland because of missing paperwork. British authorities say they're working to accept the children who've been waiting to travel for 2 weeks. The government has come under criticism for its slow or lack of response to refugees fleeing the war. The United Nations says 10 million people have fled their homes in Ukraine since Russia's invasion began almost a month ago. The majority are internally displaced. Over 3 million have fled the country in what's become the biggest refugee crisis in modern European history.
Getting out while she still can. Ukrainians have been jam-packing train stations in the western city of Lviv, close to the Polish border. And they're the lucky ones, not stuck in besieged cities further east. Refugees have headed to every country that borders Ukraine. Some have gone to Belarus and Russia, but the vast majority have headed south and west. Moldova, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and above all to Poland, which has taken in about 2 million people so far. But while people continue to arrive in Poland, earlier arrivals are trying to get on with their lives. Some are students now attending Polish high school.
I think I studied in Poland after finishing a Ukrainian school, but this is so stressful to leave your country in this moment like this.
People in Moldova, one of the poorest countries in Europe, have welcomed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians.
To see people in tears when they get a hot meal, seeing them so overwhelmed by our care, makes us feel useful and happy at the same time.
Indeed, many countries like Hungary that have resisted or refused to take in refugees from Syria, Africa, and Afghanistan are opening their borders for Ukrainians. The UK is another country that's been stridently anti-immigration in recent years. The government had been heavily criticized for its handling of Ukraine's refugee crisis, only opening its doors to a fraction of applicants. But now Britain is allowing private families and charities to host Ukrainian nationals.
I think myself, I was brought up that way, that helping people is one of those duties you have as a member of society, as a human being. And, you know, principles aren't principles until you stand by them.
How long that spirit of welcome will last will likely depend on how long the conflict lasts and how high the numbers rise. But for now, Ukraine's plight has opened borders and homes in Europe and beyond.
Well, let's bring in our guy in Brussels, Jack Parrick. How united are EU countries about welcoming Ukrainians?
Well, at the moment, there's obviously just been this huge influx of people. We know that at least 2 million people have gone into Poland. There is an attempt to try and coordinate some of the movements and the sort of relocations so that those countries, Poland and Hungary specifically, but also Moldova, who's taken a number of people, and Moldova is really Europe's poorest country, that the European Union is trying to support the efforts there. It's important to say, I mean, it's huge numbers. We understand somewhere in the region of 3.5 million people may have entered the European Union by this point, in under a month since the invasion started to take place. And the European Union, you'll remember back in 2015 when there was the refugee crisis, then mainly of people coming from Syria, was in absolute crisis mode. Actually, that year, there was only about 1.3 million people entering the European Union. So I think what we've seen is that countries, especially in Eastern Europe, are much more willing to accept people fleeing the war in Ukraine than they are perhaps people from other religious backgrounds in the Middle East, etc. But there is some unity. The question is now what happens, because Warsaw, the Polish capital, we know is about 17% larger in population than it was just a few weeks ago. And while the initial needs of the refugees is safety and shelter, food and water, eventually European countries know that they're going to need to create structures for the refugees. And we actually saw yesterday the European foreign ministers agree an additional 500 million euros, taking the total up to just over €1 billion to try and coordinate this effort a little bit more.
So, Jack, some lessons learned, but how much of a failure was yesterday's meeting of EU ministers? They couldn't even agree on energy sanctions against Russia.
Yeah, it really didn't look good. There was talk before that perhaps there were going to be some sanctions on Russian oil. It was seen quite clearly that specifically the Germans, the Hungarians very solidly came out and said that they would not be accepting any sanctions to be put on the Russian gas sector. We understood that Bulgaria, which is almost entirely reliant on Russian gas, was going to ask for an opt-out if that were the case. And so what we saw instead is that really there was no suggestion that this fifth round of sanctions that they were talking about is going to be starting to be put in place by the end of this week when there are these big summits. So I think, they tried to paint it that they've put a lot of sanctions on already, but there is clearly now some real divisions about sanctioning the energy sector in the European Union.
And really briefly, this isn't going to sit well with the US president who's on his way for those summits in Brussels.
It's not. So Joe Biden's coming, the president, for a NATO meeting on Thursday and will attend the European Council meeting of all the European leaders on Thursday and Friday as well. And they're going to have a lot to talk about because the US has been pretty firm on their sanctions. But bearing in mind, for the Europeans, when they sanction Russia, it has a much harsher effect on themselves as well.
Jack Parrick in Brussels, thank you. A Ukrainian man who survived the Holocaust has been killed by Russian shelling in Kharkiv. 96-year-old Boris Romanchenko lived through Nazi imprisonment and forced labour in several concentration camps, including Buchenwald. After the Second World War, he returned home to Kharkiv, where he became a prominent peace activist and campaigner. He was killed when his apartment block was hit by a Russian shell on Friday. We spoke to the director of Germany's Buchenwald Foundation, Jens Wagner, who personally knew Boris Romanchenko.
I was really shocked. Boris Romanchenko frequently came to the Buchenwald Memorial to join our ceremonies on the anniversary of the liberation of the camp, for example. He frequently spoke during these events. He had become a friend to all of us in the memorial, and we remember him as very engaged in struggling against fascism, for the memory of the camps and for peace. And actually, the oath of Buchenwald was his life motto. And this oath from 1945 was to build a world of peace and freedom. I've spoken and written with a lot of Holocaust survivors, but also with political survivors from the Nazi concentration camps. And all these survivors I've spoken with are shocked, really shocked. For the whole life, they had been fighting for peace and for memory. And now we have a new war in the mid of Europe.
Speculation continues to grow that Belarus will commit troops to Russia's war against Ukraine. The country has already allowed Moscow to use it as a military base and placed its weapons there. The Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko had said the country would not get involved in any military action. He may, though, have no choice.
Two leaders demonstrating how close they have become. Russia's Vladimir Putin usually keeps his guests at more than arm's length, but not this one. Belarus's Alexander Lukashenko has become essential to his military operation, even before he invaded Ukraine. At the beginning of February, the two countries held joint military exercises. The drills were a show of strength and more proof to the outside world that Belarus had become a Russian satellite. After Russia invaded Ukraine, Belarus even changed its constitution to reverse its non-nuclear status. That means all Russian weapons, including nuclear, are allowed on Belarusian soil. But Lukashenko has so far refused to commit his forces to aid Putin's war.
We are not going to get involved in the operation that Russia is conducting in Ukraine. Most importantly, I'm telling you, as a military serviceman, there is no need for it.
That surprised many. But there doesn't appear to be the appetite for Russia's war, even among former soldiers who've left Belarus and are now fighting with Ukrainian forces. At only 45,000 active members, the Belarusian army is tiny compared to Russia's. It appears, though, that Moscow needs reinforcements after losing an estimated 6,000 troops since its invasion of Ukraine. Russia is already using Belarus as a military base for its war. To have access to its army as well could help Moscow in its campaign against the Ukrainian capital Kyiv and the city of Lviv. Belarus may be resisting such a move, but if Putin decides he needs even more from his neighbour, Lukashenko will find it hard to say no.
The war in Ukraine has increased concerns in Finland about the future of their security. The country shares a 1,300-kilometre border with Russia, and while relations with Moscow have been amicable in recent decades, the invasion of a sovereign nation is making many think again. Correspondent Terry Schultz is in Finland and sent us this report.
The Kremlin has crossed many lines in past weeks. Finns are increasingly concerned about this one, their 1,300-kilometre border with Russia. At the Vaalimaa checkpoint, vigilance is the norm. But Captain Jussi Pekkala says apart from a small number of people seeking refuge in Finland, there's been no other impact from the war yet.
Of course, we are prepared and we are preparing ourselves for many kind of situation.
Finns have always lived with some degree of uncertainty, sharing this long border with Russia. But President Vladimir Putin's unprovoked attack on a sovereign neighbor has forced them to reassess. How far do the Kremlin's territorial ambitions go? Where do they stop? Finland's delicate geostrategic balance, a civil relationship with Moscow plus a well-equipped, highly trained military, has been shaken. Suddenly, and for the first time, a majority of Finns believe they need NATO. The turnabout is a reaction to Russia's aggression, says Defense Minister Antti Kaikkonen.
People have thought that we would live in a peacetime in 2020s, but now we have practically war in the middle of Europe, not so far from Finland.
Russia's assault has reignited painful memories of the Soviet invasion of Finland in World War II. Just like its attack on Ukraine, back then Moscow said it was responding to provocation. Finns maintained their independence at huge cost, fighting alone. The experience led the country to become self-reliant for its national security, with each adult trained to play a specific role in any emergency, from natural disasters to weather events to war.
Finns are not scared as such, but they are aware.
Reservist training and public self-defense courses have seen a huge jump in enrollment.
Last 2 weeks, 250.
New members?
Yes. We haven't seen anything like that before.
People want to survive, and now it's time to learn.
Things are moving fast. Next month, the Finnish government will update its national security assessment and is widely expected to take a stance on NATO membership. The Kremlin has warned Helsinki that joining the alliance would bring serious consequences. Hybrid threat expert Hannah Smith says there are already signs of Russian attempts to stir up conflict.
We have seen, for example, that there is now, both in Sweden and Finland, a Twitter from embassy has come to ask any Russian citizens to report to the embassies any wrongdoing against them.
Given this environment, Henry Vanhanen, a parliamentary advisor, says NATO is a necessity.
If we don't join, then we have to find the reasoning, what is the backbone for our security in the future as well. Would our close international defense cooperation be enough? Would the EU be enough? We don't know.
But knowing their own history and seeing Ukraine's bleak future, most Finns are now no longer willing to risk their own outside NATO.